The fossil forests of Yellowstone are a series of petrified trees in levels one above another. And if they are interpreted as in position of growth, that naturally represents a lot of time.
Back when I was in high school, a graduate student from Loma Linda University showed up. He was studying something called paleodendrochronology, which basically means ancient tree rings. The tree rings that he was studying were in petrified trees here in Yellowstone National Park. And the project itself was very, very interesting to me. But it was actually part of a much larger project run by a professor named Harold Coffin. And Dr. Coffin was interested in not just one or two petrified trees, but whole fossil forests here in Yellowstone. The interesting thing about these fossil forests is that they're stacked one on top of the other. And this was kind of a problematic thing for Dr. Coffin because he was a Bible-believing Christian. When you looked at the fossil forests stacked one on top of the other, the natural interpretation was that you had a forest, it grew up, and then it was buried. And the trees, just like this vertical tree here in these fossil forests, they're just like this. You also find fallen trees as well in the forest. Yes, on initial inspection, they look like a forest that grew up, which takes time, then was buried, and then another forest grew up on top of that. Well, under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be a controversial interpretation. However, there aren't just one or two forests stacked on top of each other here. There might be 20, 30, 40, 60, even layers of these fossil forests. Each one of them took time, and when you start adding that time together, you're suddenly talking about several tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of years to allow those forests to grow up. Dr. Coffin decided to actually come and study these fossil forests. His Christian biblical worldview caused him to ask questions about the petrified trees that others who had gone before him had not asked. And all of these questions were motivated by both his scientific curiosity and his biblical worldview.
For each forest to grow, to be buried, the next forest to grow on that new surface, on and on and on for 30, 40, even 60 levels in some areas. That represented a lot of time. And so for us who believe in short Earth history, that was a question that was raised in our minds. My motivation for the study of the Yellowstone National Park and its fossil forests was that there seemed to be some conflict between the position that these successive forest levels were in position of growth, which would take a lot of time, and the biblical record of a short Earth history. So that was in the back of my mind right from the start. The fossil forests were known by some of the early pioneers, not scientists, just explorers, pioneer explorers that made fantastic stories about them, about the petrified tree, about the petrified birds sitting on the petrified trees and so on. But a fellow by the name of Holmes was the first to really describe it in a scientific way. It was published and pretty well accepted as a situation of trees in position of growth. Erlingdorf of Princeton University, later on, quite a number of years later, also wrote in regard to it. He examined the situation, especially on Specimen Ridge in the Lamar Valley, and he came up with 20 or 30, somewhere in between there, of levels, and published it, and became essentially the authority on the petrified trees there. Since then, there hasn't been too much research done until more recently, until those of us who were questioning it began to look into it. It had been pretty well accepted as just a representation of successive growths. The first creationists who did any serious study of the Yellowstone Petrified Forest were the members of the Geoscience Research Institute. The Geoscience Research Institute was established by the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church to study into the area of creation evolution. My mind in regard to whether the trees were in position of growth or not was somewhat open at first. I thought there might be the possibility that these trees were growing on a slope and thus appeared to be in levels. But when I got there and began to really see the situation, it was obvious that they were not growing on a slope, because you could follow the surface from which the trees arose back into canyons that had been cut into the side of the hill of the mountain, and see that the levels were relatively flat and the trees were not growing on a slope. So that eliminated that possibility in my mind, and I determined in those preliminary examinations that there needed to be some more serious study. I should mention that before we actually went into the study of the Yellowstone Petrified Forest, I had an opportunity to look at another petrified forest in Nova Scotia, Canada. And there the situation is somewhat the same, although instead of being in volcanic material, it's in sedimentary material. And there's scores of levels of trees there. The strata are tipped up at an angle, so as you walk along the beach, you go from one level to another level. And at that time, I determined, and I wrote an article that appeared in the Creation Research Society Bulletin on Nova Scotia, interpreting it as trees that were drifted in. And there were evidences there for that. So that whetted my appetite for Yellowstone too, that possibly there's a drift explanation for the trees in Yellowstone. I think maybe, and this was in the literature, it wasn't something that I discovered, but in the literature it became clear to the previous researchers like Holmes and Dorff that even though there were scores of levels of trees which they interpreted to be growing surfaces, they had not found one single evidence of animal life. Well, that's very strange. Certainly there are no forests anywhere in the world that don't have also their complementary animal life. And to have this happen successively over a long period of time with large trees that represent considerable period of growth, that there would be no animals. Now, in volcanic activity, the animals could flee, of course, when it began. But you're not going to get dead animals, bones, snails, reptiles, insects, etc., fleeing. And there should be some evidence there that of the animals that live there. There was one exception, one interesting exception. We found some fossil ants, but they were inside the trees. So if the trees were transported, they obviously would have come along with the trees.
In the fossil forests, there are thousands of trees, perhaps millions of trees that have been fossilized, and yet absolutely no animals, with one exception, and that is the discovery of termites, or at least termite holes in some of the fossil trees. Here you can see what happens to a normal tree in the forest. You can see it's been eaten out by insects, all kinds of different insects probably, including termites. This particular example is interesting because it's been torn open by some animal, maybe a bear, that was going after those insects that were living in there. Real forests teem with animals. The fossil forests have essentially none, except for the few termites that were actually inside some of the trees before they were fossilized.
There has been an attempt to explain that by differential preservation, that the animal remains did not remain, they decayed and were gone. But the plant material is beautifully preserved. The leaves are almost as fresh as you would pick them off the tree in many instances. And delicate needles, you can even see the bundles of fibers in the needles and in the trees, in microscopic sections of them. So that really doesn't make sense that bones and teeth and structures of that nature, which are hard, would be eliminated. None of the locations were really easy access. There's one place where you can drive into a tree that's fenced around, a nice tall petrified tree. But the other areas are up steep slopes or back several miles from the trailhead. So we had interesting times hiking in and out. One time we got into a bad snowstorm. We were so cold by the time we got to the car that my hands were shaking. I could hardly get the key into the keyhole of the car. For individuals who have no particular reason to doubt long ages of the earth, the upright position of these trees would be a pretty natural situation to consider them as being in position of growth, especially when you see them sitting on what appear to be a growing surface with organic matter, leaves, needles, debris, twigs, so forth. Anyone who suggested otherwise was naturally going to have some pretty good evidence to counter that. Countering the idea of their being in position of growth, we noticed a number of features that just didn't seem to fit with that model of in situ growth. One I mentioned already, and that is the lack of animals. And that's perhaps one of the strongest. But where we could see the roots, we sometimes found them abruptly terminated. And that didn't seem right for trees that were in position of growth. And then another evidence that seemed contrary to what one would expect would be the fact that on many of the what we call organic levels, or supposedly growing surface levels, there was an order to the distribution of the organic matter. The broad leaves were on top, the needles were underneath, and the broken up bits of of stuff were on the bottom. And to find that kind of a sequence regularly on organic levels didn't seem to match up with what we could see when we would dig into a real soil level. There we would find the more decayed material at the bottom going up to the less decayed material, but not in any particular order of the kind of material. In other words, broadly the deciduous on top, the evergreen underneath, and then the broken up material below. Or sometimes it would be another example along the same line. We would find the broad leaves, which would be just streaks in our microscope slides. And then there would be sediment under that, and the sediment would be from fine to coarse. And another leaf below that, and then the same sequence of sediment. In other words, there was sorting of sediment between the broad leaves or the needles. One wouldn't expect that in a normal soil level. So those were evidences that we began to see rather quickly. Also, the trees were without bark. The limbs were always broken off. Later on, we did discover that there were thin layers of bark on some of the trees where the bark hadn't been completely scoured. Where there were branches on the upright standing trees, originally there was just scoured off stubs, and some of them big branches, just scoured off stubs. We tried to compare the tree ring arrangement from level to level and from tree to tree. In most cases, we weren't able to find any comparison at all. Some of the trees extend through an organic level, arise from a lower level, extend up through an upper organic level, and their tops they should have shown decay during all the time that they were living, that the second level of trees were growing, or during the time that the soil was building up around them. But there wasn't any evidence of, or very little, let's put it that way, evidence of any progressive decay over time for dead trees that were exposed. There may be some who would accuse me and other creationists of having a bias in examining these forests, a bias based on our understanding of Scripture. But really no researcher can claim not to have some kind of bias as he does his research. The idea of approaching an idea with a completely open mind is not realistic.
Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980 provided valuable new data. The mat of floating trees thrown into Spirit Lake below the volcano was particularly interesting.
When we began to examine the floating mass of trees that resulted from the eruption of Mount St. Helens, trees that were floating on Spirit Lake, it was perhaps a year later, after the eruption, that I got to thinking about it, and it was my concept of a worldwide flood and the possible flotation of trees in Yellowstone that caused me to think, aha, here are trees floating in the water. Let's see what might be happening to them. And so we went there and examined that and discovered that there were many trees that had turned upright in the water and were floating upright or were sitting on the bottom upright. You can show evidences against a theory, but unless you can show evidences for another better theory, it may not mean too much. My idea of a worldwide flood influenced my interpretation of the Yellowstone fossil forests. I envisioned, maybe I should say also that this is a tremendous volcanic area with thousands of feet of volcanic material laid down, and they're considered to be lahars, mudslides. And the thought in my model is that there were trees floating in water, and the volcanic lahars, eruptions of this volcanic breccia, moved down into the water, and then some of the trees settled down on it before the next lahar slid down into the mountain. And that would repeat itself a number of times. That model is borne out by the fact that the chemical signatures done by some of the chemists that were working with me on the forest were similar through the levels, whereas if there was time involved between one level and the next, those signatures should be different. Explorers have reported in the literature from time to time masses of trees floating out in the ocean, in which quite a number of the trees are floating upright. And I had noticed that in the literature previously. So that was part of the inspiration that led me to Mount St. Helens to examine the situation there. After about a year after the eruption of Mount St. Helens, I drove into the area, and the road takes you up through the hills and comes to a place where you first get a view of the lake. And I looked down on the lake, and here was this huge log raft covering a third of the lake perhaps. And I noticed at one point upright trees in the water. And that was sort of a thrill to see that right to begin with before we even got down to the lake. We were there, and we were able to obtain side scan sonar equipment to find out what was on the bottom of the lake. The trees in the water and on the bottom of the lake were trees that had their big roots broken, but surprisingly their fine roots were not. And we've seen that in Yellowstone too. We calculated, extrapolated, that there were somewhere between 19,500 erect trees standing on the bottom of Spirit Lake and about 12,000 horizontal logs on the bottom. You might say, well, maybe they were trees that were growing there originally and the water's just risen on them. But the lake bottom is now 200 or 300 feet higher, and the surface of the water is that much higher than the original lake. My research in Yellowstone was a wonderful experience. I never was bored. So it's been an interesting experience, and I praise the Lord for giving me the opportunity to do work that I thoroughly enjoyed.
One thing that I've learned about the scientists who came here and studied these fossil forests in Yellowstone National Park is that they were tough people. Those cliffs are really, really steep where the petrified trees are, and the hike in there is a very rigorous hike. I've also learned that scientists are going to ask different questions about things depending on the worldview that they embrace. The biblical worldview generates really good questions that scientists can go and investigate, just like any other scientist with any other worldview. There is no difference between a Christian and a non-Christian in terms of the methods that they use, but that valuable biblical worldview really enhances the science that can be done by Christians who embrace that biblical worldview. God created and God will recreate, and the time is short.